Not the constitution that is a problem per se, but those that are supposed to interpret it and then administer it.
See, what we're saying is that people should be passionate about their job. We should have people that love this country.
People say, you know what, we don't want deregulation of petroleum products. We want the subsidy to continue. We want our refineries to be prepared. But you go talk to somebody who runs or works in one of these refineries, they will tell you why those refineries can never work.
There is a present and real danger for the corporate existence of Nigeria. Generally, this government is considered as weak.
It should not be so. If we remain like that, then we remain in socio-economic and political thraldom.
So when you talk about passion, the people ruling us, they are not passionate.
Well, let's take
the House of Reps is not passionate. The senators are not passionate. That's why they are discussing without doing anything. Which sacrifice are they going to offer?
In Nigeria, governance is not about servanthood. Governance in Nigeria is about what can I get.
Hello then, welcome to another episode of The Agenda, talking about things happening in now on the Nigerian scene and around the world. And today's topic brings us back home, talking about Nigeria. And we'll be talking today with a very, very interesting person. And before I introduce him to you, we want to talk about the central bank and Nigeria's economic performance. Now, with Henry BOYO, he's a gentleman that you might have read about him or read him actually in some dailies. He's here and I'm accusing him. Well, I'll let him talk later. He's a noted economist and has accused the Nigerian Central Bank of operating a sustained faulty monetary framework that is ruining Nigeria's economy. Now that is a serious indictment, okay? And the Economist, the Economist has cited high interest rates, continuously depreciating currency, high rate of inflation, high rate of smuggling as some of the factors forcing the economy to its knees. Among the sins of the Apex Bank, according to Mr. BOYO here with me, is its conversion of foreign exchange earnings in dollars to naira before sharing among the three arms of government. Among other solutions, Mr. BOYO has advocated the issuance of dollar certificates to the arms of government as a veritable alternative. These and more we would like to review in today's special edition of The Agenda with Mr. Henry BOYO. And it's a great pleasure to have you on the show, sir.
Thank you.
And you're here on the hot seat today, and I'm going to be throwing all these questions, everything you've been saying about the government's economic policy. Everything you've said doesn't agree. I want to find out why. And people have said your opinion is contrary to what the government has been saying. And from my intro, one of the things you said, you made a point that the accumulation of the Federation reserves, otherwise known as the excess crude oil account, is unconstitutional until the enactment of the relevant law. Can you throw more light on this statement, sir?
Thank you very much. In reality, within a federal state that is based on federal principles, you will find that it's anathema for there to be central control in the first place. Okay? It is not for the center to dictate for the states or the local governments or the other tiers of government for that matter how they spend their money or in what currency they receive their money. The three tiers of government are in reality exporters when you consider the crude oil revenue, because the crude oil revenue belongs to Nigeria, and consequently ultimately belongs to the three tiers of government. So the revenue from crude oil is the revenue derivable to the three tiers of government as their own allocation. So it is not for any central body to decide that the states and local governments have no common sense on how to manage their own resources, and that the center has greater knowledge of how to manage the resources. Consequently, it is totally inappropriate and certainly not within the spirit of federalism, for anyone to capture the earnings, particularly the export earnings of the country, and then say that you should have naira in replacement. If there is any excess above what you require every year, it is supposed to be paid into the federation account and distributed accordingly. If in the wisdom of the three tiers of government, they do come together and say, we will save for the future. We don't want to spend all this money at the same time, but we need to save for the future. It remains an unconstitutional act, even if they take such a decision, until the matter has gone through the legislature and the law enacting or promoting, accommodating that decision is enacted. Until that happens, it remains unconstitutional, no matter how good that decision is. So long as there is no constitutional provision for it, it remains unconstitutional. And it really appears rather inappropriate for you to be talking of an excess crude account. In other words, an excess means a surplus. It is inappropriate for you to be talking of surplus revenue simultaneously as you have a deficit for which you are borrowing money to finance. Consequently, it is not only unconstitutional for you to have an excess crude account until such the enactment of such a law, it is also unfortunately destabilizing to even consider having a surplus when you are borrowing to supplement a deficit.
Now, coming down to elementary economics, I mean, what you have said, it's not really rocket science.
Thank you.
Apparently, if you're owing, if you have a debt, you can't have a savings, really, can you?
Absolutely.
So
you would make a better governor of the central bank and a better minister of finance, because somehow the economic management team doesn't seem to appreciate this basic economic principle that you have indicated, that it is impossible for you to simultaneously have a deficit and a surplus, especially when the procedure for consolidating that surplus is detrimental to economic growth, because it has other implications which instigate an environment which is totally hostile to economic growth and development, and indeed to the level of employment as well.
Okay, we'll talk about the hostilities involved in all this, but let's look at this situation. It has been going on for quite a while. Has it always been like this? I mean, that's a question I'd like to ask, because how long has this abuse, I call it an abuse, if the states, as you say, have a right to, their spending, and they have the right to dictate how they spend their money.
Yeah.
Why are they not doing something about it?
Well, I think the first part of your question, which was how long has this been going on,
yes,
is very important, because some years back there were reports in the papers by none other than the former Minister of Finance, who reported that the aberration became imminent or became necessary during the structural adjustment years, around 1985, 86 or thereabouts, when the government had a problem paying the amounts of money they owed to contractors. I understand maybe something in the region of 2 trillion naira or so were being owed by contractors, and they didn't have any clue as to how to meet the obligations, because oil prices were also low and they didn't have much income. And then a wise Alex amongst the team suggested that, this is not a big problem. The fact that we're earning less dollars is no big deal. Let's devalue the naira. If we devalue the naira, then we can have the little dollars we are having will be converted to a huge amount of naira, and we can pay the contractors.
Wow.
And this actually happened. And they probably clap for the gentleman and say, you are a genius or something like that. But unfortunately, that was supposed to be, let's talk about the morality of shortchanging the contractors. But unfortunately, this practice became stock And we have continued that even when we now started earning more dollars than we were earning before, even at the best times, indeed, it might interest you to know that even while we were busy paying the Paris Debt Club and all of them, the billions of dollars we were paying, we were still incurring a deficit.
That's really new to me right now.
But this is the reality. There is no year in the last 20 years or more that the federal government has incurred a surplus budget, you know, in spite of the fact that in reality, we were earning much more than we were spending.
Okay.
So you have a situation where if you now continue to convert or substitute Naira allocations for dollar revenue as a result of a historical mistake, then of course you have the ever-present problem of what they call excess cash. I am sure you have listened to, and probably you also do the same thing on your channel here, your television channel here, when you, almost all news media do the same thing. They gleefully announce that the central bank is busy mopping up excess liquidity on almost a weekly basis. And no one asks, where does this excess money come from? How come that excess money exists in the system, whereas there is no money to build hospitals and to build schools and even for the banks to lend to the real sector? It means also that the more dollars that you earn, the greater the problem of excess liquidity. And when you also announce what central bank is doing to reduce the level of excess liquidity, it makes no difference to all of you that this means that central bank is borrowing money that it does not need at up to 10% and above. Would you, my dear friend, borrow money you don't need at 10% and above? Wow. Absolutely no. But your own government has been consistently doing this, in inverted commas, crazy, foolish thing for 20-something years, wow. And you cannot, therefore, be surprised that we have remained poor in spite of increasing wealth. Because any country in which the government borrows money it doesn't need, and the government confidently tells you that we are mopping up excess liquidity. In other words, we consider there's too much money in the economy or in the money market, so we are borrowing this money back. And we are going to store this money idle without using it. Because the purpose of taking out the money is not to reuse it. Because you reintroduce the money again, well, you're exacerbating the problem of excess liquidity because you say there's too much money. So you take out money. So you cannot turn around again and spend the money because that would be like you don't know what you're doing. So it is unbelievable that anyone as important as the Central Bank of Nigeria would borrow money that it does not need at a time that we need money to build hospitals, to build schools, to build roads, to build airports, to God knows what.
Okay. So look, what has been going through my mind, Mr. BOYO, is everything you've said, okay, is really an eye-opener to a lot of Nigerians. But what makes it so difficult to accept is that we have one of the finest minds in the economic and finance realm. I'm talking about Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, the coordinating finance minister. This is somebody that is held in high repute, and every Nigerian believes she knows what she is doing. And if I may ask, what do you think, what is the catch in all this? Because we cannot feign ignorance in all this. There must be something that is allowing this anomaly to continue.
You're absolutely right. I wouldn't want to join issues with any personality.
Okay.
What I would want to do, however, is to say that no matter who that personality is,
yes,
whatever the international credentials or domestic credentials or whatever academic and intellectual credentials that person has, if that person is in support or in cahoots with any agency of government that allows or that accommodates government borrowing money it does not need at 10%, unfortunately, I wouldn't have much respect for the intellect of that kind of person. I wouldn't have much respect for whoever that person is, no matter what the intellect, if the person is also aware that the Nigerian real sector is dying primarily, apart from power, because of the high cost of funds. There's no economy in the world that develops when the real sector has to borrow at over 20%.
Yes.
Nowhere in the world. And if somebody with the highest intellectual capacity in the world does not recognize this, then I don't have much respect for that person either. No matter who that person is. And I think that you yourself would not have much respect for that person either, because it doesn't make sense that somebody is borrowing money they don't need, the money that belongs to the country, and borrowing it at 10% or more, and recognizes that a situation where there is little demand in the economy, and the industrial landscape is contracting, and what industries need, apart from power, as I've said, is cheap cost of funds, and yet that person is part of an agency of government, the economic management team, that instigates high lending rates. Because by supporting a high monetary policy rate of the central bank, which is currently about 12%, you are expecting also that the banks would not lend to the real sector, or even if they do lend, they would lend at over 20%. So no matter the international recognition of anyone like that, if they support or accommodate or are in consonance with any agency of government that creates that kind of unstable and, how would I say, poverty deepening program, I don't have much respect for that person. Unless the person can come out and say, the reason why I am part of a team that borrows money it doesn't need is because of X, Y, Z, and defend that position satisfactorily. Or to say, the reason why I'm part of a government that ensures that Nigerians will get poorer, the more dollar income we receive, I don't have much respect for that kind of person, because these are totally inexplicable. They are paradoxes that should disturb every Nigerian. You cannot have simultaneously existing deficit and surplus. You cannot simultaneously have increasing demand in the country together with increasing rate of inflation. You cannot have an increasing or expanding industrial landscape at a time that your own policies are making or necessitating 20-25% interest to the real sector. You cannot say that Nigerians are Nigerian economy will grow or is growing at 6, 7, 8% when the rate of unemployment is rising. You don't. This is not rocket science, as you rightly say. So I think maybe your question should be better directed to the Honorable Minister.
I was going to ask you and say, what happens to the visions upon visions that we put up? The visions 2020 is from 2015. It's moved to 2020 and all that. But before we even go into that, you've pointed out that despite revenue surplus, nothing justifies indebtedness of the federal government to the tune of 10 trillion naira. The AMCON bonds are inclusive. Now, what do you advocate? On this note.
Well, in terms of the level of indebtedness,
yes.
Well, the reality, of course, is that there's nothing wrong with borrowing. There's nothing wrong in being indebted, so long as the money borrowed is applied in a manner that will bring benefit to everyone. Not just even a section of the people. So there's nothing really wrong with borrowing, but there is a lot wrong with you borrowing. For example, when you borrow externally, you go and borrow like the $500 million Euro bond, you borrow at about 7% or so, Meanwhile, you have reserves which are sitting idle and which are earning less than 7%. I think maybe also you'd want to direct that question to the Minister of Finance or whoever else you're talking about. Because this, with my layman's experience and layman's knowledge, I don't think even if I was a market woman, I wouldn't take this kind of decisions. Not even if I hated what I was doing as much. So really, it does not make sense for us to say we have a deficit and we have a surplus. It doesn't make sense for us to borrow money we don't need at 10, 11, 12%. It doesn't also make sense for us or the central bank itself to consciously deliberately create a system that would instigate the banks to lend at a higher rate, especially when it also means that when banks are lending at a higher rate, the central bank also, when it goes to mop up excess liquidity, or when the government goes to borrow money from the banks to supplement a ghost deficit, they also necessarily have to borrow at a higher rate. So you yourself, you are setting, I mean, this is crazy. It doesn't make sense at all. You know, a lender or somebody who is borrowing money would want to be able to borrow at the cheapest rate. I mean, that makes sense. But not for you to deliberately instigate the borrowing cost in the country when you yourself are going to pay.
It's like shooting yourself in the leg.
Absolutely. It's like cutting your nose to spite your face. It's worse because this leads to death. You might survive when you cut your nose, but you can't survive. So that should explain to you very clearly why it has not been possible for us to grow. It should explain to you why we have received, or we have been earning, the more revenue we earn, the poorer we actually become. Because for a very simple reason, a lot of people don't understand that the relationship between you and this station is money. Basically, at the end of the day, you get a salary and everything like that. The relationship between workers and employers is money. What is binding Nigeria together is money. But if you don't, that money is like cement, it's a binder of some sort. True. If the process of creating that money is debased ab initio, every other thing within the system would go, astray. No doubt about that. So the process of determining the purchasing value of the income that you earn is defective, faulty, and deliberately construed to ensure that you remain poor. For a very simple reason. If you earn 100,000 naira as your monthly salary, for example, or let's to make it simple, as your annual salary, okay? I know you earn much more. If you earn 100,000 naira as your annual salary, for example, you want to be certain that that 100,000 naira in January of the same year will buy the same or more at the end of the year. But if, admittedly, public knowledge is that inflation, they say it's 9% at the moment, but a lot of market women will tell you they don't know where to get those figures. They may be right, but they will tell you that they don't know where to get, because if you have a wife who will probably go to the market, who goes to the market regularly, she'll tell you that, well, I don't know what they are talking about either. But even let's assume that it's within 9–10%. It means that your income of 100,000 naira at the end of the year would only be equal to about 90,000 or thereabouts. Okay? It means in another 1 year, if that rate of inflation continues, it will be 80,000 and 70,000 and 50,000. And when you recognize that the rate of inflation over the last 4, 5, 6 years have averaged about 10%, double digit definitely. Meanwhile, very few workers in Nigeria can confidently say that that rate of inflation, that their salaries has kept pace with that rate of inflation. In other words, what is happening is that every one of us would have to be trading downwards. Okay? The person who used to be able to afford a loaf of bread for himself and his children eventually becomes half a loaf of bread, then it becomes no bread at all, and so on and so forth. But inexplicably, even during this time that the individual is trading down, the country is earning more. So you wonder what's going on here. Happening? And that comes down to the point I was making, that if you debase the currency, the currency of your country, you deliberately debase it in the process of creating it, of course, every other thing would go astray. And unfortunately, the naira is consciously, deliberately devalued, debased by increasing dollar income. Because increasing dollar income becomes or translates into what is called excess liquidity when central bank captures the dollars and prints or creates naira balances in place of the dollar revenue and disburses these huge naira allocations to the 3 tiers of government, who now bank or domicile this huge naira revenue in their bank accounts. And of course, if you're a banker or you know a little bit of banking, you'll know that if a bank has 1 naira, it can lend out 10 naira. So by the same token, if, for example, the central bank is dividing $1 billion today to the 3 tiers of government, it captures the $1 billion and goes and prints or creates 160 billion naira balances okay, and places it into the accounts of the 3 tiers of government. And what happens? Those ones say, fresh money don't come. They leverage on that maybe tenfold. And it means that your $160 billion naira translates to 1,600 billion as cash, spendable cash within the economy. Consequently, the central bank says, there's too much cash in the system. And they step in altruistically, in inverted commas, to say we are going to borrow the money back in order to stop inflation. Because inflation means too much money in the system, chasing too few goods. And 1,600 billion is a lot of money chasing relative money. So in order to prevent that from happening, even though they instigated or predicated the excess revenue, excess liquidity in the first place, when they captured the dollars and substituted naira, they now come and say, we don't want Nigerians to suffer the rate of inflation. Let us help to mop it up. And they go and borrow the money back. And when you ask them, why are you doing this? They say, too much money, we need to take them. And you say, what are you going to do with this money? They tell you, we're going to store it idly without any, without applying it in any meaningful way to any side of it. Meanwhile, we're all crying for shortages in all sorts of infrastructural areas like health, education, transportation, and so on. So you can understand what I mean by it doesn't obviously look like these people know what they are doing. Or if they do know, then they are consciously pauperizing the country, people of Nigeria.
All right, Mr. Boyo, let me take you back in time a bit. Let's see if we can make some more sense out of this. Former CBN governor, his name strikes is Soludo, yes. Mr. Charles Soludo, his attempt to redenominate the naira. Do you think that was an attempt to curb this scenario that you are pointing out now? Would it have curbed it and would it have put the naira back on track?
Soludo's redenomination exercise
Ghana did the same thing, and I think it got a good result.
In 2007, before Soludo came up with this redenomination thing, first let me explain what redenomination means. It means, in other words, like in Ghana, where because of the same practice of problem of excess liquidity and mopping up excess liquidity, Ghana, in fact, was mopping excess liquidity at up to 25%. Can you imagine such madness?
Wow.
25% to mop up excess liquidity. In other words, they were doing practically the same thing. In fact, they were worse off
than we were.
than we were. So because of that practice, their currency depreciated very rapidly from maybe stronger than 1-to-1 to a situation where 10,000 cedis were exchanging for only $1. From 1-to-1 to 10,000 cedis because of this crazy excess liquidity creation. In other words, capture the dollar and then substitute local currency and things like that. So the Ghana currency depreciated to about 10,000. So and it meant that when you wanted to go buy bread, you were carrying maybe 200,000 cedi to go and buy a loaf of bread. And they thought, this is
ridiculous.
So in other words, they took out 4 zeros. From the 10,000, if you take out 4 zeros, it means that your $1,000, $1 which was 10,000 cedis, now becomes almost $1 equals 1 cedi. But don't think that has given any value to the currency. It hasn't. Because at the same time, you yourself, you are earning 100,000 naira. You won't get 100,000 or 100,000 cedis. You won't get 100,000 cedis. You will get
$100,000 rather.
No, if you are earning 100,000 cedis in Ghana and you took out 4 zeros, it means you would only get 10 naira. So your salary will be 10 cedis. Your salary will be 10 cedis. But the 10 cedis would buy you what 100,000 cedis used to buy you before. So Soludo's redenomination was to say, we'll knock off maybe 2 zeros or something like that. So if you are earning now 100,000 naira, 100,000 naira is what, 5 zeros, You knock off 2 zeros, then you have 1,000 naira as your salary. But your 1,000 naira would buy you the same thing that 100,000 used to buy before. That is what is redenomination. And that has very little, that helps portability in the cash handling operations. You don't have to carry 200,000 cedis to go and buy a loaf of bread. You take, in fact, this time, after the redenomination, you could now buy a loaf of bread with a coin, a primary coin of pesewa rather than a cedi. So by the same token, Soludo wanted a situation where cash handling operations also would be neater for most Nigerians, so that when you are going to a restaurant to eat in a buka, you don't have to carry your pocket full of money. Okay? That it was for the same purpose that the current central bank governor wanted also to introduce the 5,000 naira note, which fortunately failed. But the reality is that redenomination itself does not necessarily influence inflation. What influences inflation was the second part of Governor Soludo's strategic agenda for the naira in 2007. Indeed, I did an article in 2007, early in 2007, after I came back from Ghana on a holiday. I explained the Ghanaian redenomination problem. It was published in a number of newspapers, and they explained the redenomination exercise and suggested that we could follow suit. But first, before we should do that, we should first of all approach the issue of central bank's capture of the dollars and substitution with naira. Otherwise, we'll end up in the same situation as Ghana. And unfortunately, my advocacy at that time was derided even by the central bank. So it was a big surprise to me, even though it was a welcome surprise, when in August of the same year, 8 months down the road, I found that central bank had done a full 360 degrees somersault by saying that they were doing what they called the strategic agenda for the naira. In other words, they recognized that it was a faulty framework they had been operating, a faulty framework which meant that they would capture the dollars and print naira. They saw now that that had an adverse ripple effect on the level of inflation, on the rate of interest, on the exchange rate of the naira, on the price of fuel, and consequently, ultimately, on the amount of subsidy we are paying. In other words, today we are paying, maybe some say 1 trillion, others say 2 trillion amount of subsidy, when we don't need to pay subsidy at all, okay? We are also borrowing money we don't need, okay? When we declare ghost deficits for which we borrow to supplement, meanwhile we have the surpluses, okay? So we have rapidly built up a debt portfolio of over 10 trillion naira because of central bank's willingness to pauperize Nigerians with its framework, whereby it captures the dollar revenue and prints naira instead. So long as this continues, we would have to pray to God to make sure that we don't earn more dollar revenue. Because the more dollar revenue we earn, the poorer we will certainly become. Why? Because the more dollar revenue that we earn, the more central bank, the more dollar central bank would need to print to when it converts it to naira, and the greater will be your problem of excess liquidity, and the greater the need to mop up more of that at over 10%, and the greater, of course, will be the problem of inflation, and the greater will be the problem for you in your income, because inflation will continuously eat up your income, and the greater also the problem of subsidy, because failed subsidy would rise when the naira rate falls, and you would continue to pay subsidies for the rest of your lives.
This is getting very interesting, and I hope you've been watching, viewers. I've been talking with Mr. BOYO here. He's been giving us real facts on the issue. We're talking about central bank and Nigeria's economic performance. It's been a very enlightening session with him, and he's not through yet. So we'll take that break right now. When we come back, we'll continue from where we left off.
At quite a low level in terms of foreign currency when oil prices are so high?
Well, the truth is the reserves have been going up since November. We did have attrition in 2010, but what we've had in the last 3 months has been regular accretion. Between January and February, they went up by $700 million. I think what the numbers have shown, the numbers that came out yesterday, we're comparing mid-month to end of the month. And what happens is that we get all the oil revenue and the petroleum profits taxes early in the month and then sell down. So what we do as central bank is compare month end on month end. And between January and February, there has been some accretion.
But Governor, would it not be safer to put investors' minds at ease to increase those foreign currency reserves even more? Because at the moment, some investors are saying, well, they're worried about the exit of capital or depletion.
Well, we are moving from a history of constant depletion to one where we're getting accretion. And we'll build up
But
the reserves
slowly.
over time. Yes, over time. I mean, you've got, remember that in 2008, 2009, we had huge problems. There was a crash in oil price. There was the Niger Delta crisis. This is an election year, and we've had issues with politicians basically running down the excess crude account. But the government has listened, and there's a new attitude as far as fiscal consolidation is concerned.
In terms of what we've seen over the last couple of months, of course, the price of oil is it's a concern. And actually, when you speak to a lot of OPEC producers, they say we need it to be stable and not to increase too much because volatility is the worst thing. Is this the same case for Nigeria? Or are you concerned that because of this uncertainty, it'll just go up and down and that will make your job that much harder?
I think volatility in any market is not good for the world economy. And I also think for us in Nigeria, unfortunately, because we import a lot of our energy, as you mentioned earlier, we do not get the full benefits of the high oil price because it then translates into the higher cost of petroleum products that we import. The government is subsidizing those products, which then means that you have an increase in government deficit and government spending to subsidize. And so my job gets more difficult managing those things.
So what is the solution, and are we likely to see rate rises to keep inflation under control?
We have said that we are unwinding some of the extraordinary measures we put in place in 2009. In the last MPC, we did tighten. We'll continue to watch. Unfortunately, if inflation is being driven by energy costs or by food prices, that is really structural, and rate rises or tightening will not have a short-term impact. But certainly there is the problem of excessive government spending in an election year. There is liquidity that's coming to the system because of the Asset Management Corporation, and those are reasons for tightening. But whether we will tighten or not in March will depend on what the numbers look like.
All right, welcome back. That was an interview with CBN Governor Bloomberg asking questions on the economic issue in Nigeria and all that. And he said, the caption says Nigeria's external reserve grows by $700 million. And he said a lot of things, talking about the excess spending, government excess spending being a challenge. Now, what do you make out of that, sir?
Well, first of all, let me warn, let me sound a caution, or let me explain, I should say, that the framework, the current existing framework, portends a lot of danger, a lot of risk to celebrate increasing reserves. You could see from the Bloomberg interview, she was gunning for, oh, let us, shouldn't you have greater reserves? They say your reserves are, depleting and things like that. But you understand that as the central bank and also the Minister of Finance try to explain, the so-called reserves we say we have, the 45 billion reserves or something like that, are divided into three components, okay? The first component is what you call the excess crude account. I tried to explain this part of the component earlier on when I said, look, this is supposed to be the excess amount over and above revenue that you had targeted based on a conservative, a deliberately conservative budget benchmark. Okay? Because of the conservative budget benchmark, you automatically run a deficit. Okay? You go ahead and borrow in order to supplement that deficit. Meanwhile, you are accumulating the surplus. That surplus is what is called the excess crude account. So in other words, the excess crude account that you consider to be a relief or a buffer or a savings of some sort is actually consolidated at your own expense. Because in consolidating it, you have allowed your government to be borrowing in order to supplement the deficit. Meanwhile, they say they are consolidating an excess crude account. So you can understand that you can't, it's impossible.
It's more or less a burden right now.
Of course it's a burden. You cannot celebrate the excess crude account because the process of consolidating it damages the economy because it involves deliberate understatement of the budget benchmark for crude oil, and consequently, you create a ghost deficit which is financed by borrowing at over 10, 11, 12%. Meanwhile, you say you have a surplus which is earning practically no yield. Are you better off without that excess crude account or with a situation where you have, how would I say it, a balanced budget?
Balanced budget. Okay. Now, time seems to be running out, so I'd really like to put these questions to you so we can deal with them. You have also noted that the current CBN Forex auction pattern to the banks poses a constant threat now to the Naira exchange rate and price stability. Okay, you've talked about that earlier. You tell us more on that, sir.
You see, I will just, as a background, I'll ask you to remember the example I made with the $1 billion.
Yes,
okay?
you did.
The $1 billion translate into 160 billion naira when converted.
They hold on to the dollar.
Yeah, and the central bank holds on to the dollar. It translates into 160 billion naira, fresh naira creation. And in the hands of the banks, the 160 billion translates into, say, 1,600 billion. Okay? Already in your mind, you should see that if that 1,600 billion is now confronted with $1 billion, you would find that there's 10 times more naira in the market facing the $1 billion. Consequently, you would have, on the basis of the mechanism of demand and supply, you have so much naira chasing less dollars. So that process immediately tells you that the more dollars you earn, the greater the naira produced and created or whatever, the cheaper also will be the naira because you have more naira chasing less dollars.
Okay.
Not only that, the central bank now, the dollars which the central bank captures,
all right,
okay, it now auctions it to the banks, okay, and then the three tiers of government who own the dollars originally, go to the banks to buy the dollars at a premium price.
So it's
okay? In addition to that, the central bank also has the potential of creating a situation where the excess liquidity that comes out of the result of changing into naira drives other factors which are critical to the development of the economy. The interest rate, the exchange rate, price of fuel, and also increasing subsidies and increasing debt accumulation. So you find a situation where central bank itself, in full cognizance of the fact that all the money you hear being carried through the borders, millions of dollars or something, people are taking it to buy and go. Where do you think they buy the dollars from? From the Bureau de Change. Who supplies the Bureau de Change with the dollars? The central bank. So the central bank consciously, because it now finds that I have $1 billion that I don't really need, or I can do anything I like with, because that $1 billion now belongs to me. After all, I've given them 160 billion naira. So they can't claim to also own the $1 billion that I'm holding. So I can do anything. If I like, I can sell it to Bureau de Change. And they sell it to Bureau de Change at a time that you are borrowing dollars at 7%. You are selling your own dollars at face value to Bureau de Change.
Wow.
For nothing.
All right, sir. So that picture you've painted, we'll get back to that, because right now it's not very pleasant.
No.
It is not very pleasant right now for the economy. Now, you own that it is inexplicable that government pays up to 7% on interest on foreign borrowing, right? Okay, such as the 500 million euro bond, while CBN is supposed to get about 4% yield on external.
They'll be lucky if they do get 4% on reserves. Their so-called external reserves. The external reserves, you see, the process...
And it's domiciled with the mercantile bankers, right?
The same mercantile banks that are midwifing our loans at 7%. You know, so you find that you have a big problem.
So what's the panacea to this?
The panacea is very simple. It's not rocket science by any means. You don't use your own hand to destroy your own currency.
All right.
Okay? So all you have to do is do what is not only appropriate, but what is constitutionally compliant.
Okay.
And what is constitutionally compliant is the realization or the recognition that if you have, or you give the authority to individuals and corporate organizations to own domiciliary account into which they can put their whatever dollar revenue or dollar income they have, you cannot stop the three tiers of government from having the same rights. In other words, they can have domiciliary accounts, the three tiers of government, into which the $1 billion, in our example, can be shared by the instrument of dollar certificates to the three tiers of government. Okay. In this case, what happens? You don't have excess liquidity in the market because no new fresh naira is coming into the market. Okay? The existing naira in the system now confronts the $1 billion held as dollar certificates by the 3 tiers of government.
Okay.
And not only that, the $1 billion do not end up in the hands of the banks,
Okay.
where then all kinds of round tripping and things like that occur.
Okay.
The $1 billion remain domiciled in the central bank. The 3 tiers of government take their dollar certificates and go to the commercial banks, who now have no bonanza of fresh naira which has been pumped into the system, and the dollars have to search for their value based on the existing quantum of naira in the system. In other words, since you have no excess liquidity created by central bank, you would have what? Less naira, and you'd have more dollars. In other words, you have more dollars chasing less naira in the market. Before you know it, the naira would become a stronger currency. Because that's what it's supposed to be. And because there's no borrowing on the platform of mopping up excess liquidity, there is no reason for central bank to want to instigate the cost of lending and prevent people from accessing funds from the market. And consequently, what would happen? The banks now, who are declaring humongous profits, I understand that 2 banks alone have declared about 300 billion naira worth of profit in the last 12 months or so. The banks would now find that there's no fool coming to borrow money that they don't need as before. And consequently, they would have to go look for the real sector to lend money to. And because there's no competition in the market from government, who is borrowing 200, 300 billion naira from the banks on a monthly basis, interest rates would fall. When interest rates fall, what would happen to 6, 7% or even lower? What would happen? Industrialists will be able to borrow much more cheaply, and their goods can become competitive with those which are being brought from other countries, where the industrialists over there are paying even 1 or 2% interest rate. In addition to that, inflation will also be minimal because there's not so much money, so much naira chasing the less goods in the market.
I beg to come in, Mr. Boyo. We're on the home stretch right now. I would like to ask you my last question. It says you believe that the you believe that the naira-dollar exchange rate is not fully market determined, but it is consciously or inadvertently contrived in the favor of the dollar by the CBN monopoly of the forex market. What should be the solution in a few words, please?
Exactly. Pay the dollar component of distributable revenue with dollar certificates. Once you do that, you would now find that the market is more balanced. You don't have the destructive process of CBN carelessly churning naira into the market to chase. You see, the less dollars that are sold by CBN, the greater is CBN's reserves. But the less dollars also mean that there are less dollars in the market chasing the humongous sums of naira that CBN has created in the market. So CBN's increasing reserves is pauperizing the people of Nigeria by the process of destabilizing the naira-dollar price mechanism. A lot of people will tell you we have to produce more in order that we should have a stronger currency. Don't listen to them. You cannot produce more at a time when interest rate is 20-something%, inflation is anything from 10 to 15%, exchange rate is continuously weakening, and debt is continuously also increasing. So the reality, of course, is that is why I said, I didn't choose my word carelessly. I said, the CBN is deliberately or inadvertently creating a situation where the naira will continue to be weaker when we earn increasing dollar revenue. And that really is unchallengeable because it is the truth.
All right. That has brought us full circle on the show. We're talking about the agenda. We've been talking with Mr. Boyo here. He's an economist, a man who's versed in these issues, and he's been, agitating and he's been advocating that the central bank's system is actually pauperizing Nigerians. And I definitely hope that the powers that be are listening, and they can come and see if they can refute what Mr. Boyo has said so far, because he's ready to state his claims and prove them. Well, I hope you've enjoyed everything we've brought to you today on the agenda. Mr. Boyo, I just want to thank you for taking time out to come to the show and be with us today. It's really, I hope you find some other time to come and share more information on this issue with us next time when we call you. Thank you very much, Mr. Boyo. And I want to thank you, viewers, for staying tuned to the agenda today. It's another wonderful session, and I hope you enjoyed it. We look forward to seeing you next time when we bring the show back your way. And stay blessed till we come back.
Reserves actually still at quite a low level in terms of foreign currency when oil prices are so high?
Well, the truth is the reserves have been going up since November. We did have attrition in 2010, but what we've had in the last 3 months has been regular accretion. Between January and February, they went up by $700 million.